Time now to examine the final GI system we will be looking at in this chapter. This, of course, is the brute force global illumination mode. Now, we are working with our familiar GI interior room. Let's go, first of all, and enable V-Ray's GI systems. We want to come into the render setup dialog. Of course, we want to put a check in the on box. And because we're focusing on brute force, let's set that as our primary bounce engine. And let's disable our secondary bounce engines for this moment in time. Now, we just want to note that probably few experienced V-Ray users would choose to use brute force for an interior global illumination solution, unless that is there was a very specific need for it. Now, that can happen if we have lots of detailed geometry in the scene, then the brute force option would make a good one. It will pull all of that detail out for us. We just have to be aware that brute force is both slow to calculate and very hard to clean up on interior renders. And if we look at the control set with the brute force option, you can see we have our subdivisions parameter, which essentially is our quality control, and we have our secondary bounce option, which of course only becomes available when we have brute force set as a secondary bounce engine. One thing we could do to help clean up our scene a little bit, of course, is work with our V-Ray Sky Portal. So let's go and enable that so we give the brute force system a focus point in the scene. We can just enable that as we've done before, set the skylight option to normal. If we were to take a render from that, we would see that we make quite a bit of difference. You can see lots of detail is starting to be pulled out in the scene. We have lots of noise, but that can be cleaned up using the controls we have available to us. Of course, we have made quite a jump in terms of render time, 35 seconds in this particular render, and all the way up to 1 minute and 43 here. But in terms of how we're cleaning up the scene, that's probably going to be a penalty we have to accept. In order to clean up the noise that we currently have in our solution, really as the name of the system implies, the only option we have is to brute force push all of the quality settings up so that our noise starts to clean up. You may think that, well, really that's very simple because all we need to do is work with our subdivs option, which is true, we can definitely do that. But again, because we have a noise problem in the scene, we can just as easily use our image sampling and DMC sampler controls to clean up the solution for ourselves. Well, let's do a little bit of a comparison. First of all, let's set our subdivs parameter to a value of 24. If we were to take a render at that setting, then this is the solution that we would end up with. And as you can see, we have really cleaned up a lot of the noise, or we're well on our way to cleaning up a lot of the noise. And you can see all of the detail in the geometry starting to pull out. You see all of this detail around the window framing all being pulled out very, very nicely for us. But you can see we have also increased our render times all the way up to just over 11 minutes. Another way we could handle this noise problem is to leave our subdivisions setting as it is, and we could work with our image sampling controls. So if we come to our minimum and maximum settings for our adaptive DMC image sampler engine, let's set a minimum value of 1 and let's set a maximum of 12 in there. Now, of course, we need to make our DMC sampler controls sensitive to the noise found in the scene. So we'll use a value of 0.003 in there. And the resulting render we would get would be this, which, as you can see, got a little bit more noise, a little bit more grain. We would perhaps need to push our parameters a little bit to match our subdivisions render. But keep in mind that this option would affect every single aspect of our scene, whereas the brute force subdivisions would only be cleaning up the noise in the global illumination system. If you did note, we have actually dropped down in our render time, so we've gone from 11 minutes down to just 10.5, so we've got a little bit of leeway there for pushing the quality settings a bit more. And to add a little bit of extra quality to our current scene, let's go and enable a secondary bounce engine. Let's go and see what happens if we add light cache into this mix, and we'll just keep the default light cache settings. Let's take a look at the resulting render, and you can see now we add an awful lot of extra light into the scene, and we are to some extent hiding some of the noise problems because of that, and yet we're still getting lots and lots of detail. We can see all of the geometry very, very nicely in here. And again, we have decreased our render times. We're now down to just 9.5 minutes. That's because the system isn't having to work quite so hard to clean up the noise because of the extra illumination in there. Oftentimes, though, I like to add a secondary bounce engine. I like to add brute force as the secondary bounce engine, simply because it can add a lot of extra detail, a lot of contrast into the scene. So if we set our secondary bounces to a value of 5, and we were to examine Our next render, you can see, although we've added a little bit more noise back in, you can see all of the contact shadows, all of the contact areas work very, very nicely indeed. If you look at this area around these curtains, you can see you're getting very nice light interplay and very nice contact shadows and occlusion shadows also. Brute Force probably is not going to be our first choice of GI engine for interior settings, but hopefully we have seen just how easy it is to work with. It has a very simple control set, and hopefully we have demonstrated that this GI engine is extremely good at pulling out small details in a scene. And so if that's something that you have as a requirement, then this may well be the GI engine that you will want to use.